Good morning, everyone. Today's date is Friday, May 1st. It is episode 60 of Coronavirus Central. I'm your host, Tom Kaczynski, and I want to thank you for choosing the program today. We'll do an international show largely today. I think you guys will appreciate that. Get some good information about how things are happening around the world. Reach out to our audience there and give you a feel for how different things are in different places. Coronaviruscentral.net remains the website. And we're going to be doing some work on that over the weekend, so if it goes up and down a bit, don't be surprised. I'm expecting that to happen. Also, want to encourage people to join the Telegram group, t.me/coronaviruscentral. Always welcome to have you there. The Venmo is CVCPRV, and thank you for all the kind letters, comments, and interesting little gifts. I appreciate the seeds, by the way. You know who sent them. To P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction, Maine, 04442. So, as we go into today's episode, I could, and I was highly tempted, I'll admit, to get into a conversation about, yet again, the ongoing dissembling of the issues in the United States. Those who have been watching in real time will see the situation in Michigan, where a number of protesters were in the State House who were armed and unhappy. And we'll see that fits into a larger narrative I've been weaving. And I thought about talking about that a lot today. And originally I considered it, but I'm not going to do it because I think this weekend will lead to being able to talk about a lot more issues related to that. Today is May 1st. I know that there are protests scheduled in several states on both sides. I know from a left-wing perspective, the rent strike is picking up steam and that there are a lot of people who are frustrated economically, who are expressing their discontent by choosing not to participate in the debt-driven system. I know from the right wing, there are a lot of people who are worried and frustrated that liberties are at sincere risk, and it's a legitimate fear, and we are seeing that fear bubble up into these protests, which have the potential to become something much larger. And what I would note and hope, although I do not expect it to happen, is that there is a conversation there to be had if people are willing to talk to one another from a position of trust built upon honest sincerity about what our concerns are about the new world we are entering into of the era of the coronavirus. And yet, I don't think we're going to get there, at least in the United States. And I will say the reason why is because we've politicized the existence of the coronavirus. And I'll just give you one example. I was listening to a program from a right-wing perspective, and what they were saying essentially was if a second wave happens, that it would be because it was permitted to happen, because it was a means to facilitate the encroachment of communist philosophies onto the United States that was begun by this virus, that was done by for that purpose, whether through global entities, the Chinese Communist Party, or through the surreptitious taking advantage of an opportunity in nature. And the fact that certain governors, like Governor Northam in Virginia, Governor Whitmer in Michigan, and others have used this to assume great powers that sometimes don't seem to have anything to do with the virus, such as working, for instance, to restrict gun laws in the Commonwealth of Virginia or banning the sale of seeds in the state of Michigan, have only reinforced that narrative. And I want to say, I don't necessarily think that those governors, and I could pick Republicans just as easily, but I'll just do it this way, because I know this a little better. I don't think the governors are necessarily doing that to exacerbate a narrative. People do what they think is right in a time of crisis, and for what this crisis is revealing is how different the left and right have seen this country, continue to see this country, and the inability to come together over core divisions is an unbridgeable gap at this point. And it was part of the narrative I expected. I mean, those of you who've done a little bit of research know I wrote a book called The Coming Civil War, as well as an update to that on Amazon called Incoming, Red Lines and Hot Takes for the Coming Civil War. And the ones who read the first book would know I talked about how the left and right dislike each other. But the ones who've read the second book, a much smaller audience, would understand that I said that there were actors behind that pushing us into opposition against one another. Because realistically, the values expressed by both have validity, right? I mean, at the core of it, the best aspect of the left is the care and concern for people that are out there and the desire for justice in the sense that people deserve to be treated with dignity. And I think that that is a very worthwhile aspiration. The danger, of course, being that people on the left sometimes assume these things to be true as a matter of fact without actually validating them, and allow certain people to use their victim status as a means to manipulate the emotions of otherwise good people. Conversely, the right, at its very best, goes ahead and teaches the values of responsibility, where work leads to good outcomes and where it shows, accountability. Yet we've allowed that to be subverted into either legalism, where we just go ahead and stand up for existing contracts, and we've decided in the interest of equity to go ahead and quantify everything, where it's all about money for some people, and it's all about status at that point, and that has really led that part of the world astray, in a way where these concerns of care and responsibility should not be seen as contradictory values, but as we've been manipulated into a system where we believe falsely that we should have a one-size-fits-all solution for people, and that we've got into a political structure that basically encourages that. We have drifted very, very far apart, where we can't easily reconcile these impulses, and there's bad faith and bad trust, and that we can look at a situation as completely different, where now we see, and we see it between the different states, that in the left states, let's call them, and that's not quite fair enough, but let's just be the Northeast, the upper Midwest, and the West Coast. You see a desire that emphasizes health over economy, that emphasizes safety over liberty, and that desires to take a more guarded approach. And in the right-wing states, you see the opposite of that, most heavily typified by the South, Southeast, if you prefer, and the plain states in the West and the Mountain West, where the desire is quite different. It's to open up and to express liberty, and it's individualism versus collectivism, and these are big conflicts that are not easy to resolve even in the best of times. And this is not the best of times, and so what has happened is we have lived in a society for a very long time that pretends to preach tolerance, but has truly been intolerant in the sense that we don't consider ideas that exist outside our worldview. We label them, we brand them, and we attack them. And whether it's the cancel culture of the left or the fake news of the right, where, what the left does is it says, well, I don't want to believe this is true, so you're a liar, you're bad, I'm never going to talk to you. Believe me, I've been on the other side of that. It's a real thing. Conversely, what the right does is it looks at a series of facts and says, well, this doesn't mean what it says it means. This means something totally different, because that would make me have to change my behaviors. And that's not any better either. They're both flights into fantasy, just of different routes. And the problem is coronavirus is a reality that has many unknowns, that does change the way the world works. It makes it more collective, which the right utterly cannot seem to fathom. And the left is using perhaps a little too aggressively in some cases, rather than understanding the concerns of people on the other side. But that's a conversation we need to start. I agree with that. And that as we go forward into this new, more collective world as forced by the reality of the virus, what we are going to have to do is admit there's a lot of unknowns and have patience and understanding of core values that we want to share. And I would submit that what we have learned, and it's been one of the ironies of this process, as I've seen leftists talk about the value of guns, states' rights, and the ability of governors to act separately from D.C. At the same time, I literally saw rightists screaming, my body, my choice, that the values we've considered sacred with our secular culture are somewhat transactional to begin with, and instead we should look at core principles on which we can unite, lest we get into a shooting war over this, which is a non-zero possibility given the amount of people out of work, the problems with DC, and all the issues happening out there. Now, I'm not predicting we're that close to that right now. Things have to get a lot worse. But the virologists of high credit all seem to say a second wave is coming. The economics are breaking in many important ways. A lot of people are broke. A lot of people are struggling. And I don't want to seem unsympathetic to that. I mean, and it's sad because it's been presented as a partisan problem that the money was not there for the people. but it's not really a partisan problem. It's a structural problem about the fact that a few people didn't want a lot of people to go ahead and change how the system worked, and that's the conversation we could have had, whether you did it in terms of monetary subsidy, whether you did debt amnesty like I wanted to talk about. There were a lot of different ways. We chose none of them. And because that's happening, we are going to see a fight where people in fear retreat to that which is familiar. And as we remove ourselves from reality, I can't speak to who will win the different fights that emerge from this, whether they be just theoretical or something larger than that. But what I can say is that the virus will do more damage than it might do otherwise, because we don't want to deal with that reality. And I think we need to deal with that reality, and I've said that from the very beginning, and the reality is we're in this together. And even if the virus was completely gone today, what we have realized is that we in the United States have no shared identity anymore. And what we need to get to desperately, quickly, and openly are identities we can stand together behind. And if that means one country behind a simple set of rules, that's fine. If it means multiple countries behind different cultural understandings that fit their region and their economy, that's fine too. What I hope we can avoid is the tragedy of a fight based on a huge misunderstanding between values that ultimately have to get reconciled, and that we can learn the lesson that COVID has to teach us before we get to that terrible outcome. And for those who listen internationally, I go into this soliloquy on International Day because the reason you're not having as many problems in your countries, just so you understand, is that America is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-ideological empire that exists based on wealth and prosperity, and has basically hollowed out much else of what made us distinct in the efforts to serve, to unite the world from having massive wars, as it's done since 1945. And one can argue America did that cynically or for its own self-defense, and that we got benefits from it. And that very well may be true, but the United States, that was a humble republic of the New World, is not that anymore. And the hollowing out the American people have faced in terms of our own belief, our connection to one another, and on one hand, the cosmopolitanism, where we now have cities of the world, which sounds good, but it's lost something unique about who we are, and the hollowing out of our inner part of the country, whether it's the upper Midwest, the Rust Belt, the empty mills up here in New England, or the fights that happen in places like where I grew up in Arizona, honestly, where you have different cultures in conflict. We don't have a singular country anymore. What we have is a set of interlocking interests that work in certain ways, but that ultimately have failed. And DC, at the heart of that empire, has revealed the corruption in terms of what we're dealing with, and the fact that we never even desired, or we never seriously tried to work together. And I would blame President Trump for a lot of that, but the Democrats were willing allies in that. And this is what happens when you don't have unity. At the heart, we were the divided states of America, and the lines look a lot like 1860 as we go forward here, for those who appreciate American history. But you and other countries, when you can pull together as a group, as a single people, in terms of a single interest, then you find those other issues go away, because you can have an effective government approach if you're not afraid your government's going to screw you. And you can work with people who dislike you if you understand you have a common interest. And so as we go through this, for my largely American audience, what we should look at is what other countries are doing right, and think what we can do for ourselves, and find those third way approaches that are out there that transcend the partisan divide and solve the problems of the virus making people sick, the economy putting people at risk, and our disagreements putting us at conflict. And we should have those conversations, and I'm going to do my part to lead it, and who knows, maybe I'll go out in the field and make an idiot of myself yet again and have everyone attack me, because I do that. That's my life. I'm used to it, and it's a strange life I live. One day I'll write a biography. You wouldn't believe half the stuff I've seen and done, and my story is not what you think it is, but that's okay. Today's story is a different one. Today's story is about what's happening around the world, so we're going to do that. This evening, I am going to do the Friday night show over at YouTube, which will be at 7 p.m. Everyone loves the Friday night show because I do impressions and sometimes have a couple libations to make it more entertaining for you all. As well as I've started to do over on the YouTube channel some smaller snippets where I don't know how often I'm going to do it, but people like it, and if I get the urge to do it, I can do a 5 to 10 minute piece on a given issue, like I was talking about unemployment, which if you listen to the podcast, you already know. But I wanted to share all that with you. We're going to talk on Monday about the fallout of the protests on Saturday and the rent strike, I'm sure. I mean, maybe there's nothing and I can just get to the science of this, but I know better than that, and so do you. So let's go into the statistics now that I've done my little soliloquy in hopes that I can reach a lot of people. And I'll just say this, if you're exhausted from this, you're not the only one. I've had literally 3/4 of my former friends attack me over the position that I've taken, which is to treat the virus as real because they see that as treason against ideology. And when you believe your ideology trumps reality, that's when you need an adjustment. And I don't know what else to say about that. So it's really sad because they're taking a good idea in a bad form, in a fear-based instinct, that's going to lead to terrible outcomes. And there's nothing I can do to stop them. So all I've done is dissociated what I can from people who are going to act understandably based on fear, but irrationally nonetheless, and hopefully looking for a new solution. Not because I'm afraid of a fight, incidentally, but because they're fighting over the wrong issue. And the fight that needs to be had is, how do we live in this new world of the virus rather than pretending the virus isn't real because we don't like it. And I don't like it either. It doesn't mean I'm not going to deal with it, and I don't like that it means certain outcomes are going to be necessitated. But, reality is that way. I don't like when I'm cold, I have a cold, I have to blow my nose. Doesn't mean I'm not going to do it. So anyway, COVID19info.live, we're going to give you some updated numbers here. Let's hit refresh so we can see what the most recent ones are. 7:40 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time on May 1st. 3.308 million confirmed cases, 233,792 confirmed deaths, 1,047,775 confirmed recoveries. United States is well over 1 million cases at 1.074 with 62,955 deaths. Well, that's 1,971. The big countries on the death count remain Spain, Italy, UK, and France, all of them having between 24 and 28,000 deaths, and the UK is the fastest mover, a gain of 676 to 26,859. Add another, looks like about 1,100 cases, and they'll pass Spain, who's at 27,967 that's Italy. I apologize for that. So they'll pass Italy, and it looks like right behind that is Spain and France. And then there's a pretty big gap to the next highest country in deaths, which oddly enough is Belgium. Even though they've only had 49,000 cases, they had 7,703 deaths. A lot of the European countries in the 6,000s, the larger ones. Brazil is also in that group. Netherlands just short of 5,000 on deaths. And the only other countries that are over 100,000 cases right now are Turkey, Russia, and Iran. Is just south of that, but it's going to pass into it. And Brazil is about to enter that group as well. China says it's at 82,000. I guarantee you they're past that group. So that's your quick sort of update on what is happening internationally. So today I'm just going to take a glance around the world, sort of opine on things at a little bit more of a leisurely pace, because we've had a lot of big pieces out there today, and we're going to talk about some of the implications of things. But I was asked to look a little bit into the food insecurity issues on an international level. We're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about the U.S.-China conflict just a little bit after we go through the world. And I got a deeper update on what's happening in Canada as well, through the provinces up there for our many Canadian listeners. So, the U.S. Sun put out a piece here. This is by Tom Michael. It was published at 11:46 a.m. Eastern Time yesterday. Wave of fear. World on a knife edge as coronavirus cases spike and cities shut down again after lockdowns are lifted. And this is something we see quite a bit about. I also saw some pieces in the New York Times talking about where the problem areas are likely to be in the U.S. going forward. Not surprisingly, overwhelmingly in the South, given what's being tried down there. We will talk about that next week as it begins to manifest, because I'm going to do international today. I might not get a chance to again for a while. The world is on a knife edge as coronavirus cases spike and cities shut down again after lockdowns are lifted. The dangers of easing restrictions have been highlighted this week after Germany and Spain saw cases spike as they try to edge out of quarantine, while China was forced to tighten regulations to fight off a second wave. So we have updates from different countries we're just going to touch on real quick here. Germany. Germany has slowly been easing its lockdown after faring better than its European neighbors, allowing non-essential businesses to reopen around a week ago. But the country reported 1,304 new cases of the virus on Wednesday, up from 1,144 on Tuesday and 1,018 on Monday. The country's virus reproduction rate, known as R, which measures how many people the average person with COVID-19 infects, has also bounced back to just below 1. That means one person with the virus infects one other on average. Earlier this month, the rate was at 0.07. Chancellor Angela Merkel has warned the R rate increases if the R rate increases even slightly above 1, then the country's health service faces being overwhelmed. She said, if we get to a point where each patient is infecting 1.1 people, and this is the R naught we've talked about, just not recently, then by October we will be back at the limits of our healthcare system in terms of intensive care beds. If we get to 1.2, we will hit the full capacity of our health system as early as July. There has also been a steady rise in the number of deaths from 117 on April 25th to 188 on April 28th, and the country has already been planning for a second wave of killer coronavirus. In Spain, which has allowed some non-essential workers to go back to work, the death toll rose by 453 on Wednesday, up from 301 the previous day. The number of new infections also shot up by 4,771, compared to 2,706 and 2,793 the previous 2 days. The figures come as the country prepares to ease restrictions further, with hairdressers and other small businesses due to start reopening next month. The Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez announced on Tuesday a 4-phase plan to lift the lockdown. The implementation will vary from province to province depending on the infection and death rates, as well as other things like hospital capacity. And they have an interesting chart here that shows the number of COVID deaths per millions of population. So in Belgium it was 642, Spain 510, Italy 453, UK 392, France 353, Netherlands 265, Ireland 239, Sweden 231, Switzerland 199, and USA 178. And that's looking at the countries as a whole. So we'll see. Those are still with small amounts of people potentially infected, depending on whose numbers you believe, anywhere between 1 in 1,000 and 3%. I know that's a really big range. Japan. One island in Japan has also been hit by a second wave of coronavirus after taking the decision to lift its lockdown. Hokkaido eased restrictions on March 19th, allowing businesses and schools to reopen after cases fell to 1 or 2 a day. But 26 days later, the island has reinforced its lockdown after 135 new cases were reported in a week. Dr. Kiyoshi Nagase, chairman of the Hokkaido Medical Association, told Time, "Now I regret it. We should not have lifted the first state of emergency. It really may not be until next year that we can safely lift these lockdowns." And it's this sort of period, I just want to draw attention to this. This 20 to 40 day period is how long the gap is going to be between the opening and the suffering, if you want to call it that. So, and we're seeing this in other places. So that number, and that fits what we've seen of the virus and what you would expect it to have a little bit of time to relaunch or reboot. All right, China. In China, too, where the deadly bug originated, there have been signs of a feared second wave after lockdown restrictions were eased in recent weeks. A city of 11 million was put on lockdown last week, and that's Harbin, after a silent super spreader infected 70 people. And China has shut down gyms and swimming pools in Beijing this week amid fears of a fresh outbreak. It's feared these actions show the Chinese authorities are battling a fresh spike in cases. But the true extent of the spread there is impossible to know for sure, with many questioning the validity of official figures. In other countries, however, there have been more positive signs. So, and this one's parts labeled hope. In Austria, new cases have remained below 100 for nearly 2 weeks now since reopening some non-essential shops. The country plans to ease more restrictions throughout May, allowing more businesses and even hotels to open, and abandoning restrictions on non-essential movement. And wearing masks everywhere they go has been part of the Austrian solution. I didn't say that, but I think it's worth talking about, as people here are saying that I'm not afraid of a virus, I'm not going to wear a mask. And the thing about it is, I get that people are trying to show that they're dealing with their own fears, but honestly, you're not showing that you're brave, you're showing that you're selfish. It's not for others you're doing it. You're not for yourself you're doing it. You're doing it for others because you're not just trying to not get yourself sick. but you're trying to not get others sick. And that's what we need to do. We need to be invested in one another. And all these people who are saying they're not afraid are really just revealing their selfishness. And I know they're mad at me for saying that. They can be mad at me. I don't care. The truth, that's what I do with this program. I speak what I believe to be true. And it's not to say that I'm always right, but I'm trying to be sincere because we just don't have time to waste when lives and health is at stake. We have to say things that are true. And it's going to piss people off, so be it. People need to be pissed off, maybe. Anyway, you can hear my frustration, right? In Denmark, the number of new daily cases have stayed under 200 for almost a week, apart from a spike of 235 on April 25th. It began lifting its restrictions on April 15th by reopening schools before allowing more shops and hairdressers to reopen this week. Norway, the Czech Republic, and Poland are also seeing tentative signs of success. Watching closely. The UK government and others are nervously watching nations where restrictions have been lifted to see if there's a dreaded second wave. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab told a press conference yesterday, the issue of a second spike and the need to avoid them is not a theoretical risk. It is not confined to the UK. Having relaxed restrictions in Germany over the past week, they have seen a rise in the transmission rate of coronavirus. And as Chancellor Merkel has said publicly and has made clear, they might need a second lockdown in Germany if the infection rate continues to rise. So this risk is very real. France is also looking to ease its own lockdown from May 11th, with the country divided into green and red zones that will have restrictions lifted at different speeds. But the country's PM, Edouard Philippe, said it was a delicate balancing edge which rested at a knife's edge. He said, we must protect the French people without paralyzing France to the point it collapses. A little too much carefreeness and the epidemic takes off again. Too much prudence and the whole country buckles. And that's really the question. I mean, you do have to balance them, and it is a balancing act, and the balancing act works. You do need people to be able to go out there and to conduct certain economic activities. But the problem is you also need them to do so in a responsible fashion, and you can only do that if you were literally going out there in a way where you're being serious about it. And I even look at this article, and you see the first comment on this. If this virus purposely wasn't related or created and released by communist globalists, they sure got lucky at having it as a way to accelerate their goals for world control. And what we're doing is we're talking past the virus. And I'll be blunt. I think people do absolutely appropriate these things for their pre-existing issues. It's no doubt. I think it's entirely possible that there is some guilty cabal behind this at some point. I mean, yeah, maybe. Who knows, right? We'll never know that. But ultimately, it doesn't change the reality of what we have to deal with. And if you can't get past the obstacle they throw at you, it's like saying you're in a fight, right? And someone shoots a bullet at you. You can come at them with the voice of justice, but if you're dead, you're not going to win. And that's where this virus comes in. You got to deal with the problems in front of you, as any soldier would know before you start worrying about theoretical constructs. And the problem in front of us is the coronavirus and what we're going to do about it. And once we figure out a way to get in front of that, then we can deal with the restructuring of our society, the question of who was responsible for this, and go ahead, which we all, I think, want to do, is hold anyone to account who might be responsible, if there is someone. And if no one proves to be to account and we can actually believe that, then that's fine too. Then we go ahead and restructure our society and understand that, we'll have to go forward with these challenges, and we can go back to, if not something that has normalcy, something that has sanity. So the next piece I'm going to go to here is from National Public Radio, NPR.org, and we're just talking about Russia briefly, because the numbers really are spiking over there. And getting great information out of Russia isn't necessarily possible all the time because of some of the way the media works over there. But there are over 100,000 cases and moving quick. So this is from May 1st. Just want to give you a quick update over there, because when countries are moving fast up the chart, especially when they're big nuclear powers that used to be part of the Cold War world, and there's an accelerating conflict between the U.S. and China, we got to talk about Russia. Russia's prime minister says he has coronavirus as the country tops 100,000 cases. Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin says he's infected with the novel coronavirus, joining nearly 106,500 others in the country who have been similarly diagnosed. Speaking during a video conference with President Putin that was broadcast Thursday on state-run Rossiya 24 television, Mishustin, who took over as prime minister from Dmitry Medvedev in January, told Putin he had tested positive for the virus. It has just now become known that the coronavirus test I gave came back positive, Mishustin told Putin. I have to follow self-isolation and observe the order of doctors, he said. This is necessary to protect my colleagues. Mishustin, whose role as head of government is considerably less powerful than Putin's, nominated his deputy, Andrei Belousov, to take over as acting prime minister, a recommendation Putin approved by decree. The 54-year-old Mishustin, who has been a lead figure in handling Russia's response to COVID, said he would maintain active contact with Putin and other leaders on all the main issues during his self-quarantine, according to the Moscow Times. Putin thanked the prime minister and acknowledged that becoming infected could happen to anyone. Interviewed later by the business daily Kommersant, Mishustin said he was experiencing a high fever. Russia has been hard hit by COVID, with infections topping 100,000 on Thursday after a record single-day increase of 7,099 of newly confirmed cases, with more than 1,000 people having died of the disease, according to official data. The latest figures appear to run counter to pronouncements made by Putin in recent weeks that Russia is slowing the spread of the virus. And I want people to see this. I mean, the other reason why it's important to look at the international thing is, for those who think this is a hoax, every country really isn't in on it. I mean, honest to God, these countries, they don't like each other. They hate each other. They have totally divergent interests, divergent cultures. This is a real problem, and it's pummeling countries all around the world. And I get that a lot of people didn't see it early enough, right? So this is like one of the problems I'm utterly convinced is at the heart of this crisis. That the government's lies in the beginning, if we go back in the United States, the government's lies in the beginning saying this isn't that bad, this isn't the flu, that narrative that was put out there in February and March to go ahead and bolster the market when the reports that we shared that the CDC and other actors were privately giving, including the intelligence community, said the very opposite, set the expectation for people thinking it wasn't that bad. The government pivoted and said, oh, it was that bad, and then they went back to it, the original narrative, and said, no, we got it wrong. But in fact, the change was probably correct. And that is the root of the problem, that you tell a lie at the beginning, and you set a false expectation, and when you build a lie at the foundation of what you're doing, what you end up is with only bad policy choices, because you have to deal with all the cognitive dissonance you've created. That in the U.S. is a huge problem, and it's a problem in Brazil and some other countries too, but especially in the United States, you have this issue that, there was the expectation this isn't that bad, and that you have the cherry picking of information. Like you grab, and I get this all the time. People will send me one thing, oh, there was an empty nursing home, or oh, there was 2 doctors who were against. Yeah, there is a small amount of people who dissent on the seriousness of this virus. They represent 5% of the population. If you want to go ahead and follow that advisory, you can, but keep in mind, it's not because 95% of the people are in on it. It's because we're looking at the evidence out there, and we're making different judgments. And I was there at the very beginning. I saw what China was doing in January. I was reporting on it then, and you could see the problems. And if you've seen it for that long, you live in a world where the facts are different. In my world, the virus has been a fact that is going to cause a problem for a very long time, and I saw that ideology tried to subsume reality. And that is something you have to stand against. You have to look for reality. And we're going to do that with this program, where we look at the evidence of cases, and we've evolved in what we think. And I've been very clear about my own failures. I had a much more morbid expectation for what the first wave would carry. Gratefully, it's been wrong, and that's fine. And we have to prepare for worst-case scenarios and develop an understanding of threats that are out there as we look at this. In business, they teach, what is it? It's called a SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you always want to keep a close eye on that threat box. And I knew the strength of America was dealing with a direct attack, right? The weakness was we don't work well together. The opportunity was we could go ahead and use this as an opportunity to come together. And the threat was that a conflict over something we disagreed on the purpose of could be utterly dissembling. That's where we're at, and every country faces those opportunities. The coronavirus is just a mirror when it really comes down to it about what you're willing to do to take care of your people. Do it well like the Austrians have, or the people in Taiwan, and you'll get through it okay. Do it poorly, and you get to go ahead and listen to Coronavirus Central every day talk about the dissembling of the United States. Anyway, my ranting aside, let's go to marketwatch.com, and we're going to take a look here at UK deaths, what's happening there, because the numbers are up, and there have been a lot of nursing home cases that were brought in. As I said, this is from the Market Watch, which I think does a good job. UK deaths passed 26,000 mark for the first. Figures include nursing home cases for the first time. This was published on April 30th at 3:36 a.m., and this is by Lena Segoyle. I hope I'm saying that right. Okay, and updated figures mean if UK's official death toll is now higher than France's or Spain's, and I think it's going to go ahead of Italy's pretty quick here. Britain's still got a lot of road to go through, and it's tough to be in the Anglosphere unless you're in the Southern Hemisphere. Hi to all our friends in Australia and New Zealand. Britain's death toll from the coronavirus disease COVID has risen to 26,097 after the government started including deaths in care homes and the wider community for the first time. Previously, the government had only counted people who had died in hospitals after testing positive for coronavirus. In the first statement since changing the way the figures are produced, Public Health England said the total number of deaths included an additional 3,811 deaths since the start of the pandemic, 17% higher than the previous data showed. And I will say they had planned on getting to that, and they had, in fairness to the English, or the UK, I should say, the British, they needed a little time to compile this, and we expect that. That's going to be a problem worldwide. It's just a question of if you're doing it. We have to be a little understanding of those numbers lagging, and there's always going to be numbers lagging. Of these, around 70% were outside of hospital settings, while about 30% were in hospital. The new numbers mean the UK's death toll is higher than France's or Spain's. Speaking at the Daily Downing Street briefing, Britain's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab emphasized that the latest figure of coronavirus deaths did not mean there had been a sudden surge in deaths. The retrospectively tabulated COVID deaths were spread over the period from March 2nd to April 28th. The number includes 765 deaths reported in the 24 hours ending at 5 p.m. on Tuesday. Only people who died after testing positive for coronavirus are included in the new total. The jump in the total deaths will increase pressure on a government facing criticism for failing to protect the staff and elderly residents of nursing or care homes and too slow to impose a lockdown. Raab deputized to act in Prime Minister Boris Johnson's stead during the latter's convalescence from his own COVID infection, warned of the dangers of lifting lockdown restrictions prematurely, saying, "We mustn't gamble away the sacrifices and progress that we have made." Data released by the Office for National Statistics on Tuesday showed that the number of care home deaths linked to coronavirus has risen sharply. The Care Quality Commission recorded 4,343 deaths of care home residents in England between April 10th and April 24th, the ONS said. Rob said the UK now has the capacity to conduct more than 73,000 tests for the virus per day. As of Tuesday, 52,429 coronavirus tests had taken place, still short of the government's target of carrying out 100,000 tests per day by the end of April. But that's your numbers there from the UK. And just generally speaking, that the UK is sort of trucking along, and just comparing the rates. The daily rate, if you take out those numbers, is about triple what you're seeing in France, Spain, and Italy. Just to give you an example, 676 in the UK compared to 268 in Spain, 285 in Italy, and 289 in France in terms of the deaths. And it holds pretty close to that too in the 24-hour case gain rates. Britain gained 6,034. At the same time, Spain gained 2,740, Italy 1,872, and France 2,633. So you're definitely seeing it grow faster. And the only countries that are growing faster than the UK, obviously the United States are getting numbers for it, and Russia and Brazil. And it's interesting to see some of these heavier populated countries moving up the list. Peru's moving up the list pretty quickly. And I'm just looking into the countries that are lower numbers. Mexico's moving up a little bit too. Eventually we'll have to take a look what's going on down there. It hasn't sounded good, but I'm going to have to do more research before I jump into that. They're at 19,224, and that's a gain of 1,425. And I'm sure the accounting down there is not entirely accurate due to not having a great healthcare system compared with other places. And that's the problem for Latin America and the third world in general. The statistics, frankly, are going to be lagging inadequate indicators. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit. Singapore has been a country that we talked about in the beginning of this quite a bit. We haven't talked about them in a while because they have been incredibly aggressive in case tracing, tracking, trying to keep the problem from coming forward. But there have been problems, and Singapore is starting to have their own second wave, despite having incredible tracking mechanisms in place and a very aggressive effort in a very small location that is pretty homogeneous. So let's talk about that. This piece is from New York Times. This was published on April 28th But I had this shared with me, and it's a good example of how even when you do things right, and these are countries that are being very aggressive, the virus still goes forward, and we need to be aware of what happens. And really what you find is the nature of economic activity, the movement of goods, people, services, and places to accomplish things creates environments where the virus is going to go out there. And you can't escape it fully. Singapore hasn't tried to do that, but it shows you that this is really out there and it's just ongoing. And the challenges that even good policymakers are going to have to deal with, let alone ones that have disjointed policy. So this piece is by Wei Yi Kai and KK Rebecca Lai. So this is packed with migrant workers, dormitories fuel coronavirus in Singapore. Singapore has seen a surge in coronavirus cases among migrant workers after months of successfully controlling the outbreak. As of Tuesday, coronavirus cases linked to migrant worker dormitories accounted for 88% of Singapore's 14,446 cases, including more than 1,400 new cases in a single day. And I think this is also interesting, too, because when they bring in migrant workers, okay, they're bringing them from places where they say there's not a lot of cases and there's not a lot of tracking. So obviously that's not going to be true. Singapore has extensively traced the close contacts of each person infected with the coronavirus and released detailed information about clusters of cases. An analysis of the data shows how the virus has spread rapidly among migrant worker dormitories. Many migrant workers lived in packed dormitories on the outskirts of the city. These dormitories can house up to 20 people per room, making it almost impossible to follow social distancing guidelines. Migrant workers around the world have been among the most vulnerable groups affected by the pandemic. The government has directed all laborers living in dormitories to stop working until May 4th, imposing a stay-at-home order for 180,000 foreign workers in the construction sector. The government has also declared 25 dormitories as isolation areas where workers are confined to their rooms. Transient Workers Count 2, an advocacy group for migrant workers in Singapore, criticized the government's plan to quarantine such a large population together. The group compared the lockdown with situations on cruise ships in which cases multiplied uncontrollably even when passengers were kept in their rooms. The Singapore government requires a minimum of 48 square feet of living space per each worker. So what is that, 6 by 8? That's pretty small. According to dormitory visits conducted by Transient Workers Count 2, here's a typical layout of a 20-person dorm room. And you can see a picture of it. It looks like they put 10 beds, 6 on one side, 4 on the other, in a room that's 39 feet long by about, the way they draw it's kind of hard to tell, but let's call it 16 feet wide. And then there's a shared bathroom for all these people in an entrance. And that's going to get everyone sick. But I understand Singapore doesn't have a lot of space. It's an island on the Straits of Malacca. So what are they going to do, right? S11, a dormitory with the largest cluster of coronavirus in Singapore, houses more than 2,200 people who are infected. The dormitory has a capacity of over 10,000. Singapore Health Ministry officials suspect that Mustafa Centre, a 400,000 square foot mall, is the starting point for infections at the dormitories. This shopping center is popular among migrant workers, local residents, and tourists. And they show the dormitory clusters where each one represents each case. S11's got the biggest one. The Sungai Tengah Lodge has another in Tuasville Dormitory. And they literally can trace down to the individual person on this. And then the local clusters are at the Mustafa Center and the Project Glory construction site. And what they can do is they have a lot of contact tracing, and they can do that. And, that's a problem because some places, in Asia where people are kind of used to living under authoritarian systems and being tracked by their governments, they're okay with that. Whereas, things like tracing mechanisms like that don't fly in the West for reasons that have some real validity. It's complicated, but they're not crazy reasons. And I think we'll have to talk about that again on Monday. Anyway, some of the cases in dormitories have also been linked to the construction sites where the migrants with the virus work. The biggest construction site cluster is Project Glory, a 51-story office tower in the downtown business area linked to at least 6 dormitories. More than 20% of Singapore's population of 5.7 million are foreign workers, the vast majority of whom are low-wage laborers with work permits. Many of these migrants come from Bangladesh and India, and they work in construction, shipping, manufacturing, and domestic service sectors. The breakdown of nationalities among the confirmed cases shows that workers from these countries have been disproportionately affected. Migrant workers in Singapore have long struggled with a lack of medical care. A charity provides subsidized healthcare for these workers. Suggested this problem was especially acute during the coronavirus outbreak and may have contributed to the explosion of cases among migrant workers. And I would say if these are Singaporean residents, citizens, that you would probably see they would maybe handle it differently. Because if you look at the numbers here, the nationality of confirmed cases, Singapore citizens is 1108. And when you look at all the other people, Bangladesh alone, Bangladeshis in Singapore have 2,920 cases. So what you see is a little bit of a two-tiered approach forming, and that's going to happen in some countries. Some countries will be okay with that, other countries will not. And how that deals for Singapore, the throw them in the dorm strategy, is an interesting question and speaks to actually a cultural difference. That they're probably going to protect their own and care a lot less about protecting people who are there just to be used for their labor, whether they're Bangladeshis or Indians or, I see there's some people from Chinese, Myanmar, Malaysians, Filipinos, and Thais. Anyway, so that's a glimpse at what's happening over there in Asia. And what we're seeing is a lot of countries are working through a similar story where they're trying to get around and through these sort of issues that are happening. And that you have, for countries that have high surveillance, they're watching these outbreaks happen. And when they try to open up a little bit, they see that this recurrence happens. So that has been a problem for them in moving forward. And they're being very sort of patient about how to deal with that. We're going to now transition over to North America. I talk about the U.S. a ton, but instead we're going to talk about Canada today. And this piece is from the CBC. That's the main Canadian broadcasting company, the government-run entity up there. And it's coronavirus, what's happening in Canada, around the world on April 30th. Updated as of 6 hours ago. Hey, none of it got their first case. That's what the Arctic Circle is called up there, where the Inuit live. The Parliamentary Budget Officer predicts a $250 billion deficit. So, let's see what the latest says. As a number of provinces outline plans for relaxing restrictions and reopening their economies, Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer warns the federal deficit for the year could hit $252 billion as a result of the COVID pandemic. Those numbers are based on the nearly $146 billion in spending measures the government has undertaken in response to the pandemic, the decline in the country's gross domestic product, and the price of oil remaining well below previous expectations. This has got to be beating the crap out of Alberta's economy because they already had problems. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau defended the government's spending in his daily COVID press briefing Thursday, saying Canada needs to invest now to make sure an economic recovery will be possible as quickly as possible. Canadians are strong and resilient people, and our economy was in great shape before going into this, Trudeau said. That's debatable, but they certainly have handled it better than the U.S., at least in terms of handling how their people are approaching it. There will be a time after this is all done where we have to make the next decisions on how that recovery looks, but right now our focus is in getting through this as a country. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney announced a 3-stage plan to reopen Alberta's economy on Thursday. The plan will begin next week with the resumption of some non-urgent surgeries and office reopenings for service providers such as dentists, physiotherapists, speech and respiratory therapists. Provided there is no surge in infection rates, the province will move to stage 1 of its relaunch on May 14th, when some retail stores and businesses will be able to reopen. Those will include clothing and furniture stores, hair salons and barber shops, museums and galleries, and restaurants and bars, as long as they maintain only 50% capacity. And I just want to insert this point because I keep making it. How are businesses supposed to be able to be successful when they are low-margin businesses required to have half as many people in there? I just don't understand what the logic of rushing into that is, because I get why they're doing it, but they want people to survive and they want them to have some money coming through. But unless you go ahead, and maybe Canada will, I haven't looked, unless you cut the expenses, which is that you cut the costs of doing business, if you slash utility rates, which would be harder to do, or you slash rents, which would be easier to do probably, because in theory you could go ahead and just have a pause on that until you get consumption going forward if you do that. And I think that will be the smarter solution. But I don't think anyone wants to touch that because, frankly, the people who get paid rents often have the most money, and that's who governments tend to listen to. But we'll see what happens in Canada and how they deal with it. It might have implications for the U.S. because in a lot of ways they have a very similar economy. Access to provincial parks and public lands will also be reopened using a phased-in approach. Alberta Parks online reservations will be available May 14th to book sites visiting beginning June 1st. Physical distancing guidelines will be maintained and gatherings will be limited to 15 or fewer people. arts and culture festivals, major sporting events and concerts, movie theaters, swimming pools, recreation centers, arenas, spas, gyms, and nightclubs will all remain closed. Stage 2, which has no firm date attached, would see things like the potential reopening of kindergarten to grade 12 schools and access to more personal services such as artificial tanning, manicures, pedicures, waxing, and massage. Theaters could also reopen under specific restrictions, and larger gatherings would be permitted. Stage 3 would see the return of arts and culture festivals, nightclubs, gyms, and pools, and non-essential travel. Earlier in the day, Dr. Janice Fitzgerald, Newfoundland and Labrador's Chief Medical Officer of Health, that's out there on the Atlantic Ocean, to our good friends out there in St. John's, unveiled a 5-stage plan for relaxing public health restrictions in that province. The plan comes as the province marks the 4th straight day with no new COVID cases. The only immediate rule change is the expansion of the household bubble, the immediate group that the people live with and interact with under public health restrictions. Now households can pick a second household to spend time with. They're pretty serious about how much they've locked it down up there, but they've had some benefits. Canada hasn't been hit nearly as badly, especially outside of Ontario and Quebec. Fitzgerald's update came on the same day that Ontario Premier Doug Ford offered further guidance to businesses on how they should go about reopening. In a news briefing, Ford said he was laser-focused on reopening the province economy as the infection curve in Ontario is flattening. Manitoba unveiled its own phase plan for reopening some sectors of the economy on Wednesday. Prince Edward Island and Quebec have also offered glimpses of what the next coming months may hold. Also on Thursday, Nunavut reported its first confirmed case of COVID, according to a media release. In the release, Nunavut's chief public health officer, Dr. Michael Patterson, wrote that such news was only a matter of time and the individual is currently in isolation and doing well. We ask people not to place any blame, not to shame, and to support communities and each other as we overcome COVID in Nunavut. Premier Joe Savikkatak was quoted as saying in the release. As of 8 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, there were 53,236 confirmed and presumptive cases of coronavirus in Canada, with 21,437 of the cases considered resolved or recovered. The CBC tally puts coronavirus-related deaths at 3,279 in Canada and another 2 deaths of Canadians abroad. The new coronavirus cases causes mild or moderate symptoms for most people. For some, especially older adults and people with existing health problems, it can cause more severe illness or death. The Public Health Agency of Canada says the risk varies between and within communities, but given the increasing number of cases in Canada, the risk is considered high. So I just want to read here, and they have updates from each of the provinces, and since I want to do that, I don't want to read what they say about the U.S. because we're having a much harder time down here. And I will give the Canadians credit for one thing. They are very agreeable people. And that solves some problems because you don't have to get into arguments over what you're going to do as much, and they generally don't get into arguments, so good for them. Police in British Columbia, this is a hint from around the provinces, because we talk about the states, so I'll let you see what it looks like in a country where you handle things a little differently. Police in British Columbia have made visits to some 500 homes in the province to make sure recently returned travelers are following rules to self-isolate. They perhaps didn't take this as seriously as we would like, said MLA Ravi Kalon, who is responsible for overseeing the process for the BC government. So a local officer would knock on the door and say, hey, the province is trying to get a hold of you. You need to call them back. Do that in Texas, you get shot. A meat processing plant in Alberta that is at the center of COVID outbreak is set to reopen on May 4th with one shift, a decision the Union for Workers at the High River facilities described as incredibly concerning. The Cargill plant has been linked to more than 1,200 cases. So we are seeing the meat problem that we were talking about. That's going to be an issue in Canada as well. Saskatchewan. Premier Scott Moe is clamping down on travel between communities in the far north of the province as the region deals with an outbreak of COVID. Moe says he's ordering a ban on non-essential travel between northern communities. The government is also sending $20,000 to La Loc to fund public safety and food security. Manitoba is going to start easing some of its COVID-related restrictions starting on Monday by allowing dentists, physiotherapists, retail stores, hair salons, and restaurant patios to open at no more than 50% capacity. So that's Winnipeg. Campgrounds, museums, libraries, and art galleries will also be allowed to reopen, but all have to maintain physical distancing and comply with public health restrictions. At his daily briefing on Thursday, Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced 65 new safety guidelines for businesses as the province prepares for gradual reopening. We're on a path to reopening the economy because we can see the curve is flattening, Ford said. I'm laser focused on opening up things as quickly as we can. The province reported 459 additional cases of COVID on Thursday, a figure consistent with new daily case counts seen throughout much of April. The death rate from COVID in Quebec will remain very high for the foreseeable future, Premier François Legault warned Thursday, even as he sought to address criticism of his government's plan to ease pandemic restrictions in the coming week. Of the 98 new deaths recorded in the past 24 hours in the province, 92 have been of seniors in care, and I know Quebec's looking to open up. New Brunswick reported no new cases for the 12th day in a row. Still, Premier Blaine Higgs extended emergency measures for another 2 weeks with some revisions. Health officials have identified 12 new cases of COVID in Nova Scotia, bringing the province's total to 947, while the number of deaths remains at 28. Most of the deaths have occurred at the Northwood Long-Term Care Facility at Halifax. Now, fits what we see in the UK and in the United States. The home is facing the most significant outbreak of any facility in the province, with 208 residents and 73 staff infected as of Wednesday. Prince Edward Island's premier is reminding people that the first phase of the reopening that begins this week doesn't mean a return to normal. All of us, we have had to make painful and disruptive adjustments to our lives. I wish I could tell you that would end on May 1st, but that won't be the truth. Dennis King said, read more about what's happening in PEI, including how the virus is spread, is ensuring tourists won't be coming to the island anytime soon. I was in Prince Edward Island this year. Wonderful island, beautiful people, clay beaches. But the problem is they depend heavily on tourism, and for Northeast Canada, you know, this is going to be a big problem. It's going to be a problem for Maine, too, actually, up here in America. I've read studies that say our economy is going to get hit harder than anywhere else, and they're not even going to open hotels here until July. So keep an eye on the state where I live for things to get a little funny, because I know there's a lot of people really unhappy about that. But, you know, this is the price of being safe, and that you see the communities in the northern areas generally, in the United States and in Canada, but just all northern, are more restrained about it, how they're going. And that's a cultural difference, actually. It's a difference, too. It might be why, with the exception of Sweden, which is just weird, the Scandinavian countries in Europe had less problem than the Mediterranean countries. So let's see if that holds true because of cultural differences. Newfoundland and Labrador unveiled the provincial government's 5-stage plan for relaxing public health restrictions Thursday, including benchmarks that need to be met as the province progresses from present conditions, what it calls Level 5, to living with COVID, which is Level 1. The first step was announcing the expansion of the household bubble. We talked about that, and none of it is saying they have their first thing. So that's what's happening in Canada, and this is pretty good here. All right, so that gives you a feel for what is happening in the north, and as we go forward here, I want to talk about this piece. A lot of people have asked me to talk about the food question in light of what it means globally in terms of imports and exports, and I've looked for articles that kind of put a good summation on this. And I think with this, I'm grabbing a piece from The Nation, which is sort of a kind of news sort of opinion. It's in their civil unrest category. The Nation, just for the interest of full clarity, is known as sort of a progressive blog. But I think when it comes to issues like this, frankly, the left is going to do a better job of covering the question of international interconnectedness, just because it's the way they think, whereas a lot of things I report on of direct from the farms at the bottom tend to have more of a right-wing perspective. And you just can't help that certain ideological groups are more interested in the plight of people who fit their view of how the world should work. So the international focus usually tends to be more leftist, and the national domestic focus tends to be more rightist. And I sort of can't escape that, but the piece is fair and it makes good points, so I'm going to read it because that's what we do. And it's good that y'all get exposed to things you're not used to, you know, because that's what we try to do, and I try to be fair about that. And I know if I make half the people pissed half the time, it probably means I'm being honest, so that's good. COVID's third shockwave, the global food crisis. Many people are already going hungry in the United States. Many more will face hunger or starvation in other parts of the world. This piece was published at 5:50 a.m. today, May 1st, by Michael T. Clare. In San Antonio, 10,000 families began arriving before dawn on April 9th to receive free boxes of food at a shuttered mall. In a normal week, 200 to 400 families might show up. In Nairobi, Kenya, thousands of desperately poor people seeking food aid on April 10th were beaten back by police, causing multiple injuries. In Dhaka, Bangladesh, thousands of unpaid garment workers defied stay-at-home orders on April 13th to block roads and demand their wages, saying they'd rather risk contagion than go without food. "We are starving," said one protester. "If we don't have food in our stomach, what's the use of observing the lockdown?" Even as people around the world grapple with the medical and economic consequences of the COVID pandemic, many are also facing yet another great calamity: food scarcity. Either for lack of funds or lack of supply, poor and newly jobless families are finding it increasingly difficult to obtain the food they need. With both economic contraction and joblessness expected to accelerate in the coming months, the number of families facing food insecurity and starvation is bound to soar. Major world disasters produce multiple ripple effects. Like a powerful tsunami, they trigger one shockwave after another, each producing injury and mayhem. In the case of COVID, the first wave was the global health crisis, still spreading around the world. Next came the stay-at-home requirements and the resulting shutdown of the world economy, resulting in massive job layoffs everywhere. These, in turn, are producing a third wave, possibly even more catastrophic in its outcome: the collapse of the global food supply systems and widespread human starvation. Supply chains at risk. COVID's assault on global food availability is coming from two directions. On the supply side, farmers and distributors are cutting back on production as major customers, schools, restaurants, hotels, airlines cease operations, and food employees become sick. On the consuming side, poor and unemployed households are running out of money and unable to buy food even when it's still available on local markets. As is true of other commodities such as oil and iron ore, the availability of food products is highly reliant on global supply chains, with most countries depending on imports for at least some of vital foodstuffs. This is true even in large countries with extensive agricultural industries of their own, such as Canada and the United States. These supply chains are vast and well organized, but nevertheless vulnerable to disruption from storms, wars, droughts, and other systemic shocks, pandemics included. The continued globalization of modern food networks is introducing an unprecedented level of complexity to the global food system, insurance giant Lloyd of London observed in a 2015 report on global food insecurity. Disruptions at any one point in the system would be likely to reverberate throughout the food supply chain. Volatile food prices and increasing political instability are likely to magnify the impacts of food production shocks, causing a cascade of economic, social, and political impacts across the globe. Lloyds drew this conclusion from a food system shock exercise analysts conducted, akin to a Pentagon war game, and from its analysis of the Arab Spring protests of 2011, which were triggered in part by rising food prices across North Africa and the Middle East, a phenomenon widely attributed to severe droughts over previous months in Russia, China, and Australia that sharply reduced global grain supplies. As one producing country after another banned wheat and rice exports, worldwide grain prices soared, causing misery from poor families in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and other countries that depend on bread for a large part of their diet. Although current conditions have not yet reached this degree of distress, it appears as if such a breakdown is beginning. The self-defeating drive by countries to impose export controls on medical gear in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic has spread like an infection to foodstuffs, noted Cullen Hendricks of the Peterson Institute for International Economics on April 6th. So far, Russia, Kazakhstan, Thailand, and Cambodia have banned the export of processed grains, and Vietnam has put a moratorium on new export contracts for rice. Such steps, Hendricks warned, augur poorly for global hunger and political stability. And this is pretty simple, right? What ends up happening is when you run out of food and the politicians can't solve it, hungry people are angry people, and that's when violence happens. This is well understood internationally. There's a reason why we still talk about them, let them eat cake 250 years after the fact, The curbs on international trade and travel imposed by governments around the world in response to the pandemic have also played havoc with global supply lines. Many ships and planes remain idle because of such restrictions or because key employees are sick or afraid to show up for work, slowing the delivery of vital supplies and adding to a surge in food prices. In East Africa, international efforts to combat a historic plague of crop-devouring locusts are being hampered by a slowdown in the delivery of pesticides. In the United States, food delivery has been deemed an essential activity, and state and federal authorities are doing what they can to keep supply lines intact. Nevertheless, significant disruptions are already beginning to occur. Food processing and packaging, a key step between farm production and delivery to local markets, often involves close interaction among numerous and typically low-paid workers, and so is at high risk for the spread of coronavirus. Large meat processing plants employing hundreds of workers are at particular risk. As of April 25th, Coronavirus outbreaks at 30 such plants had sickened over 3,300 workers and killed at least 17. Workers at these and other such facilities said they were pressured into working without adequate protective gear, even after state and national guidelines called for such measures. And just so you know how bad the thing on PPE is, I'm literally going out there, and I read an article about how the governor of Maryland, Republican Larry Hogan, literally has secretly hidden Maryland's mask supply and put the National Guard to put it there to keep the federal government from confiscating it. Really not a great sign. Now, with the number of COVID cases soaring, the major meat processors, Tyson Foods, JPS USA, and Smithfield Foods are closing their facilities, punching a big hole in the U.S. supply chain. Industry leaders say meat production is now down by at least 25% and is likely to contract further in the weeks to come. On April 28th, President Trump invoked emergency powers to keep meat processing plants open, but union officials say it's nearly impossible to establish a safe environment for workers at these facilities. Using executive power to force people back on the job without proper PPE is wrong and dangerous, said Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO. Meanwhile, farmers report they cannot find customers for their crops as restaurants close and processing plants go idle, resulting to vast surpluses on the farm and scarcity in many towns and cities. Many dairy farmers in Washington, for example, or Wisconsin rather, an example, are dumping thousands of gallons of fresh milk into lagoons and manure pits every day, since their regular customers, schools, restaurants, and hotels are not buying their products, but the cows must still be milked. And if you don't understand that, it's pretty simple. If you stop milking the cows, it stops producing milk. And it causes a lot of sickness for the cows. Elsewhere, farmers have had to plow under ripe vegetables in order to make way for new crops. Some surplus produce is provided to local food banks for distribution to the poor, these farmers report, but they lack the capacity to do this on a large scale. As a result, perfectly good food is being destroyed while people go hungry. And to me, that's kind of one of the interesting questions, right? What you see happening is that you see that the way the economy is functioning in this is really the root of the problem. The resources are there, but ultimately, this is one of the problems that is out there. Is that you don't have an ability in the way our social credit system kind of works, because that's what money is. It is a credit system to get things from farm to person. And we're going to have to think about that as we go through this, because it's going to be a big problem. And having those critical points where you have to go to processing is going to be really hard, because that's where the virus is going to spread. So a prediction I'm making of a necessity we need is decentralized agriculture, where you get more things from your community, and that might mean having less diversity of choice in your food effort, but at least you'll have the ability to survive safely. And you need to be working to do that in a way where you're going out there and providing food for yourself. That's why I spend so much time gardening, and I know my wife has already told me that tomorrow I'm going to be working in the field, and that's okay. You know, it's rewarding. I mean, it's tough work, and to be honest, you're going to screw up a little bit in the beginning, but start now, and it'll help too if you're in quarantine. Anyway, even where supply chains remain intact, many poor countries lack the funds to pay for imported food. This has long been a problem in the least developed countries, which often rely on international food aid to finance essential imports, and is becoming even more severe as the number of people without jobs multiplies and donor countries balk at higher aid expenditures. Many poor countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, already reeling from the collapse in employment, now face the heartbreaking challenge of feeding millions of people with their hungry and starving citizens. The pandemic has posed a particularly harsh challenge for the oil-exporting countries of the global south. Typically, these countries, including Algeria, Angola, Ecuador, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, rely on oil export revenues to help pay for imports and finance food subsidies for the poor. In recent years, oil prices have averaged around $55 to $60 per barrel, less than historic highs, but enough to keep most governments afloat. With the COVID pandemic and resulting economic contraction, however, the worldwide oil demand has plummeted and prices have fallen to less than half their January 2020 average. A price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, now temporarily halted, has also contributed to the price decline. This in turn has decimated the producing countries' budgets and left them unable to finance essential food imports, with devastating consequences for their poorer citizens who must now pay inflated prices for whatever food is available or go hungry. Venezuela is at particular risk from this turn of events. Food supplies were already hard to come by in local markets before the pandemic as a result of corruption, economic mismanagement, and U.S. sanctions against the government of President Nicolas Maduro. Only the sale of crude oil via circuitous routes, sales on major markets being blocked by U.S. sanctions, allowed the government to pay essential bills, But with oil prices cut in half by the pandemic's crippling effect on demand, food imports have come to a virtual halt, and Venezuela's poor now face even greater scarcity and fatally higher prices. And keep in mind, this is why you want to have your local food sourcing, because no one else is going to help you. Historically, a contraction in food supplies and sharply rising prices have sparked widespread social unrest. This was true, for example, in 2008, when a sudden doubling in the price of grains triggered food riots around the world and led to the ouster of Haitian Prime Minister Jacques-Edouard Alexis. A few years later, of course, came the Arab Spring. In the wake of these events, Lloyd's conducted its food system shock exercise in 2015 to assess the implications for the insurance industry of such planet-wide disruptions. Under this scenario, droughts occurred in several areas of the world simultaneously, and most major food-producing countries banned exports of their key products, causing shortages in import-dependent ones. The outcome, immediate price spikes in many parts of the world, leading in many places to fierce anti-government violence. Food riots break out in urban areas across the Middle East, North Africa, and Latin America. African troops are deployed into Nigeria but fail to stop the country from falling into civil war. Yemen, Egypt, and Tunisia experience further food protests, which lead to changes in government and so on around the planet. Unrest of this sort is less likely right now because of people's fear of gathering in large groups, but is occurring nevertheless. There was, for example, that April 9th outbreak in Nairobi and those protests in Dhaka. Food protests have also been reported in Honduras and South Africa. In Italy, additional troops were sent into the south and Sicily amid fear of assaults on supermarkets sparked by impoverished residents. Even in the United States, nervous food bank volunteers have called on the National Guard for protection in several states where the number of people seeking provisions far exceeded the quantities available and the atmosphere became tense. Some analysts also worry about widespread human migration as hunger intensifies in crop-scarce rural areas, prompting desperate families to move to cities or other regions in search of food and income. If food supply chains have become disrupted and livelihoods untenable, vulnerable populations are more likely to move in search of assistance, observed the UN Food and Agricultural Organization in a recent report on the impacts of COVID. Such movements, added, would further threaten the spread of virus and heighten social tensions. Taking food seriously. All of these trends, troubling as they are, probably represent only a few of COVID's impacts on global food insecurity. Large numbers of people are already going hungry in the United States. Even larger numbers will face hunger or worse in other parts of the world as COVID-19's multiple shock waves spread ever outward. At the same time, while dealing with a COVID-19 pandemic, we are also on the brink of a hunger pandemic, said David Beasley, Executive Director of the UN World Food Program, in a virtual meeting of the UN Security Council on April 21st. Even before the virus began to spread, he noted, 135 million people around the world were marching toward the brink of starvation. Now, as a result of the pandemic, that number could swiftly grow by another 130 million people. As suggested by officials at the FAO and WFP, most of these people were marching toward the brink of starvation, live in the areas of the global south that were already suffering from drought, climate change, and effects of war. And you know, one thing they don't include in here, but let's be blunt, is they have client states, like whether it's China, U.S., Russia, that support a lot of tin pot dictators that, frankly, provide certain goods, and in exchange they get help from these countries. But ultimately, if they don't have things to spare, they're not going to listen to them. And I do think that you're going to see certain countries make plays to help ones that are useful to them. Like, for instance, China sending rice, let's say, to a country, just pick one, Nigeria, because they want access to those oil supplies in the future. But that's a part of this story as well, that beyond the poverty of those countries, that a lot of times that poverty is actually encouraged by international actors who use that as a means to control resources. I mean, the great game continues. It just has different rules and a lot more hypocrisy. Anyway, it is. However, the poor and jobless in every society, even the richest, could face severe food scarcity in the months ahead. It follows that local, national, and international leaders need to devote far more attention to the food supply equation, ensuring that not only every person is provided with a basic minimum amount, but also the price of basic staples remains affordable. Doing so is not only a moral obligation we share as members of the human family, but also an essential prerequisite for national and international stability. And it's realistically, I mean, absent that, you're going to see international instability. You're going to see countries fall. And that's going to lead, it's the domino effect. You see cascades. Instability in one area moves people around, which causes divergent responses, which leads to more instability. It's like the refugee crisis all over again. And I think this time will be interesting. In the past it was an ideological issue, but at a time when Americans are going hungry, let's see what happens differently, or Europeans, if they're going to be so inviting. I know Asians won't be because they don't think that way. And I don't mean that to be mean. I'm just saying Asians are very ethnocentric, and it's absolutely true. You can read it. They say it. They don't apologize for it. On the international level, ensuring adequate food supplies requires dexterous diplomacy aimed at persuading major food-producing states, including Russia and Vietnam, not to ban exports of their key staples, and for transit states to facilitate the shipment of vital supplies. In addition, immediate financial assistance should be provided to countries needing funds for essential food purchases and to the WFP, I guess it's the World Food Project, for emergency deliveries to refugee camps, indigenous communities, and other populations in extreme needs. Within the United States, vigorous efforts will be needed to ensure the safety of critical food processing facilities and the integrity of national supply lines. Equally important is the delivery of food to poor and other communities in need. Many cities with well-organized civic and governmental institutions are already undertaking such efforts, such as the free meals being provided to adults and children at 435 grab-and-go locations at schools in New York City, but many rural and poor communities lack such institutions and need greater attention from volunteer organizations. And I think we should pull this, actually, one more sentence. Some ad hoc efforts have been made by volunteers to collect surplus food from farmers, lacking customers, and deliver it to food banks, but a far more systemized program of this sort is needed. This is going to be a place of divergence where you're going to see cities try to have organized efforts to do things, and they're going to say, we can stay closed because we can do things together, and you just see rural areas diverge and say, we need to open because our system can't work this way, and you're not habituated to working that way. So it's actually legitimate needs that lead to part of the divergence, because you can't have a governor impose a solution for a state that kills how a rural economy works, or conversely have a solution that helps the rural people. Like, let's say Texas is a good example of this probably. What Greg Abbott does will probably work well for a lot of West Texas, but might be utterly deadly in Houston. And these are the problems you have, and you really need to allow hyper-regionalization in the approaches. And people are talking about that, and I think that's good. It's a very, very different what you have to do between rural and urban areas, and the understanding of that needs to be something we look at from all sides, where you don't force one to do what's against its interest. You need to allow the most local entity to understand the decisions in this if we're going to try to get through this as safely, as painlessly as possible. Ultimately, Ultimately, ensuring food for all is everyone's responsibility. Family or individuals seeking to assist local food banks and pantries, whether as volunteers or through donations, can contact the nearest one by consulting the Find Your Local Food Bank option at Feeding America. The nation's leading network of local food banks. Donations can also be made to Feeding America to support these endeavors. Ultimately, a global food crisis could affect us as much as the more immediate impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. Not only will we be exposed to or experience ourselves genuine hunger, but we could also witness widespread starvation around the world, along with popular upheavals and mass migrations. Ensuring food security should therefore constitute an essential component of any local, national, or international drive to overcome the harsh impacts of COVID-19. So, and this is by Michael T. Clare, Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College and Senior Visiting Fellow at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C. So, that gives you a little bit of a feel for what's happening with the food issue out there. And it's a real issue. I can't say how bad it's going to be, because really it depends how bad. It's a complex equation that has to do with the food instability, the political instability, and how bad the virus gets. I mean, the more the economy breaks down and its ability to move things, the less resilient the food supply will be. And that's why the number one prediction I'm making for people, especially if there is a reopen. If there is a reopen, it's a good time to go get what you didn't get the first time, because this thing is not getting better soon. It's going to get ugly, especially if you're in the U.S. If you're in other countries, I mean, I don't know your domestic situation well enough, but I can always recommend having food on hand and the ability to grow things locally is a good decision wherever you live and however you think about these questions. So as we talk about instability that's happening out there, it's been noted in many places that when you have instability economically, food-wise, that wars result, and that also results because of geopolitical problems. A number of you have been following, as have I, the issues in North Korea with the disappearance of Kim Jong Un, the leader of the Hermit Kingdom up there, and the problems that has, being basically the biggest flashpoint between the U.S. and China, aside from potentially Taiwan or maybe Hong Kong. So I wanted to share this piece because I think it does have a lot of relevance, potentially, if true. And we don't know if it's true. Rumors go like crazy, and I can't give you better than rumors because literally the whole world intelligence community is chasing rumors. But this is the latest of them, and this was published at updated 6:58 Eastern. So I literally brought this up 13 minutes after I started broadcasting. This is from thedailymail.com. North Korean defector says he is 99% sure Kim Jong Un is dead, and the country could announce it this weekend. Defector Ji Song-ho said he had been informed that Kim died last weekend. Ji said Kim's sister was in line to replace him after a complicated succession. Kim is not seen in public since April 15th, and reports say he had surgery. Seoul and Washington have played down rumors he is gravely ill or dead. And we don't know where he is, and there's a whole lot of problems with that, rumors like crazy. But let's see what this one says, just to give you a feel for a big problem out there that could be a flashpoint that leads to problem. I mean, honestly, as much as we're talking about these problems, this could end up being a Sarajevo crisis if both the U.S. and China decide to push into this and can't come to an agreement, which, for reasons, is possible. A North Korean defector claims he is 99% sure that Kim Jong Un is dead, saying that Pyongyang could announce the news this weekend. Ji Song-ho told South Korea's Yonhap news agency that he had been informed that Kim died last weekend after cardiovascular surgery. The defector said Kim's sister Kim Yong-jong was in line to succeed her brother, but said the secretive state was grappling with a complicated succession issue. Kim has not been seen in public since April 11th, and his absence has sparked a wave of speculation about his health, but Seoul and Washington have played down claims that he is seriously ill or dead. State-controlled media in North Korea has not provided any definitive proof that Kim is alive beyond reports of letters sent in his name. Ji, a defector who was elected to the South's parliament earlier this year, is the latest to suggest Kim might have died after heart surgery. I've wondered how long he could have endured after cardiovascular surgery. I've been informed that Kim died last weekend, he said. It's not 100% certain, but I can say the possibility is 99%. North Korea is believed to be grappling with this complicated succession issue. Pyongyang has never made any succession plans public, but experts say Kim's sister has been the most visible presence around the dictator in recent years. She was named an alternate member of the ruling Workers' Party's powerful Central Committee Politburo last month. North Korea is the world's most secretive country, and reports about Kim and his family, including the suggestion he recently had heart surgery, are nearly impossible to verify. However, other defectors have cast doubt on whether such sensitive information would ever leak out of Kim's inner circle. Some defectors say that their relatives in North Korea did not know that Kim had been missing from the public view for 3 weeks. One said people had been talking about Kim's whereabouts in very private circles after he failed to appear at a ruling party showpiece on April 15th. Kim's unprecedented absence for the Day of the Sun ceremony honoring his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, prompted major speculation about his welfare. I talked to my sister and my niece this morning, and they had no clue about these reports and the rumors about Kim Jong Un's health, said one defector, Lee Soon-hee. When I told them, they were so cautious about discussing it. North Koreans have a very limited knowledge of these things. Lee defected to the South in 2009. North Koreans are keenly aware they could face punishment for discussing the Kim family, said Sokil Park of Liberty in North Korea, a group that works with defectors. That doesn't mean that people don't take that risk. Some people do, Park said, but it's still a super sensitive issue. It's a little like the Pope not showing up for Christmas, he said of Kim's absence from the April 15th ceremonies. South Korean officials say they have not detected any unusual movements north of the DMZ. The South's minister in charge of North Korean affairs said on Tuesday that fear of the coronavirus could have kept Kim away from the ceremony. U.S. President Donald Trump just said yesterday, I understand what's going on. I cannot just ask him about it right now. I'm just hoping everything will be fine, but I do understand the situation very well. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said he was aware of reports on Kim's health and was paying close attention to developments. Still, experts say it is strange North Korea would not release a picture of a healthy-looking Kim if there was no truth to the rumors. Official media has not provided any verifiable proof of life since April 11th, other than reporting that he had sent messages to North Korean workers and to South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. Another defector-turned-politician, Tae Yong-ho, has warned that only a small handful of people would know the full story. He has also cautioned that clues about Kim's whereabouts, such as an apparent sighting of his personal train in the city of Wonsan, could be deliberate diversion tactics. Pyongyang officials know the train can be seen from satellites and have previously sent it around the country to confuse outsiders, Tae said. The sighting of the train is followed by further satellite images from Wonsan showing boats often used by Kim and his entourage. So we don't know what's happening there, but it is a big question, and we will see what ends up happening as this goes forward. And it's a big story. If we get news this weekend that Kim is dead, China's going to have a stake in that. The U.S. is going to have a stake in that. Korea's going to have a stake in that. Japan's going to have a stake in that. And it might be an opportunity for people to push the narrative a little bit, because it looks like the United States... No, let me put it differently. The Trump administration wants to push against China a little more. Bit by bit, we're seeing this. And this is reported in The Independent. And you can go watch the news conference. So this is out there. And I'm going to put this piece out there here. And then we'll see if I close with it. Coronavirus. Trump says he has seen evidence COVID-19 came from a Wuhan lab. And this is by John T. Bennett in Washington. Donald Trump claimed on Thursday he has seen evidence the coronavirus originated from a medical laboratory in the Wuhan province in China and threatened to slap new tariffs on the Asian economic power. And before we go into this, I want to say one thing. I actually believe there's probably truth in this, and I laid out an extensive story for why I think that's the case. Nonetheless, I want to say the fact that the American government is saying this is very different than Tom Kaczynski of Coronavirus Central, because when the President of the United States starts claiming the virus that's changing the world and that has killed 60,000... What number are we at here? I don't even keep track of the numbers anymore. They're so high. That has killed... Back to page 1 here. 62,955 Americans and counting came from China. That has consequences. And that is going to lead to incredible anger being directed toward China, regardless of the fact that this article should tell you 16 intelligence agencies don't agree with that. And keep in mind, those 16 intelligence agencies would lie to you with a smile on their face because they understand the consequences of truth or this lie or this assertion and what it means, that it's something you can't walk back, that will have unpredictable consequences. Nonetheless, we are seeing this argument being made by the president, which very well may be true, and what it reflects is a anger and divergence between the U.S. and China that is deep within the American administration and has international effects, leading to the fact that if America and China are pushing at each other one or more, especially at the time North Korea is falling apart, that's led to wars before, and that is not an impossibility. So let's continue. The president this week ramped up his criticism of Beijing after spending several weeks only suggesting Chinese leaders knew the novel virus had gone public in their country. He also on Thursday questioned why China allowed people to leave and travel around the globe when they knew some had likely contracted COVID-19. And that's a fair question, actually. I think he's asking good questions in a lot of ways. I don't agree with a lot of the responses, but this is true. During an event on seniors that turned into a press conference, the president was asked, have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus? He replied, quote, yes, I have, and I think the World Health Organization should be ashamed of themselves. Let's talk about the World Health Organization for 1 minute. The World Health Organization has basically been working with big tech throughout this thing to censor anyone who disagrees with their thing. And keep in mind, the World Health Organization didn't even treat this as a pandemic until we were well into March. So I have thought of them as a compromised organization in a lot of ways. Some of the science they do is very good. Some of the politics they do is very bad. But ultimately, it's hard to put a lot of faith in them, the CDC, the NIH, or any of these institutions out there. And I want to. I'm tracing the science when there are facts there, but the institutions themselves being at odds against each other is a part of the story, as is the deeper narrative of the fact that the American bureaucracy and the American administration don't work together, which has partisan and odd structural components that make things uglier. Nonetheless, the fact that the president is going out there essentially saying to a public audience, yeah, China probably was involved with this, is going to make it impossible to kind of walk this back into a sense of just dealing with the virus, because the anger is going to be transferred. And I am predicting, actually, that that's going to be the going right-wing response, that they're going to say, we're blaming the Democrats who are commies in bed with the China, and we're all in support of this. And that's what you're going to hear from the right. I know, because they're already saying it. And the left is going to say the crazy dictator is making things up that is going to go out there and he's going to try to get us all killed and use this as an excuse to put through every policy he wanted. Because that's what we're going to see from there. And between those two arguments, it's going to be really hard to have a sane, civil conversation. And even in our own community, I talk to people in the coronavirus community, it's hard to shake the two-party system. We've got to do it, or we're all going to end up in a civil war. Got to do it. So, and other wars besides. This is the sort of stuff that killed Russia in 1917. And if you look what Stalin did in the gulags, you don't want that future. Just take my word for it. Okay. We're going to see where it is, the president said. We're going to see where it comes from. Some former intelligence officials instantly pushed back. It's interesting they say former, so these are people who are not seeing the intel. Whether the virus originated in a market or accidentally escaped a lab would have had no bearing on the warnings Trump received and ignored, nor on the preparatory steps he chose to take. And I think that's actually true. You can criticize the policy, but it's interesting they're including this in the article. Ned Price, a former CIA and Obama White House official, tweeted as Mr. Trump was still speaking in the East Room, "This is all about manipulating intelligence for political ends." The Trump administration has launched an intelligence community probe seeking information on what Chinese officials knew and when and what the World Health Organization knew. His administration also wants to know if both entities covered up what they did know. Asked if he has seen evidence that the virus originated in a virology clinic in Wuhan, the president replied, "I can't tell you that. I'm not allowed to tell you that." But he promised his administration will release conclusions from their investigation. Earlier in the day, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a statement saying U.S. intel officials have concluded the disease is not man-made. But of course they would conclude that for what they release, and this is the thing, what the intelligence community releases to the public is part of disinformation operations, so it doesn't really mean much if the intel community tells you things. And trust me, I've talked to enough intel community people, that's just how that works. So the intelligence community is trying to avoid escalating this crisis between the U.S. and China. That's their goal in this, regardless of whatever they believe privately. All right, the entire intelligence community has been consistently providing critical support to U.S. policymakers and those responding to the COVID virus, which originated in China. The intelligence community also concurs with the wide scientific consensus the COVID virus was not man-made or genetically modified, the DNI statement said. Notably, the director's office indicated the statement was produced via a unanimous finding of all 16 American intelligence agencies, which can be rare. But in another odd scene, Mr. Trump did not appear to know what was the acronym DNI, nor give much credence to the statement, saying only, "I haven't seen the statement." And that's interesting, that literally you have the bureaucracy of the American government drawing different observations than the leadership of the American government, and that's been part of the story. That we saw the same thing with the CDC. We've seen this divergence in policy measures, and it really speaks to the fact that the president doesn't have control of the American national government in a lot of ways, and that's been the case for a very long time. We are taught in the United States that there are three branches of government, right? That, you learn there's the executive, that's the president, the legislative, which is the Congress, and the judicial, which is the courts. And those are all branches, but there's really 5 branches in the government if you really understand it from an honest sense. The fourth branch is the federal bureaucracy, which is the unelected people who do the day-to-day working, and they sort of end up being their own sort of an oligarchy that has their own long-term interest about money. And when you read about the revolving door, K Street, people who go from being head of the USDA, your chief undersecretary type who actually make the policies to decide who gets the contracts, that no one ever talks about, that makes how the money works. That is a big part of how D.C. works and why, you have 8 of the 10 richest counties in America down there. And the fifth element is the United States military, which is a force unto itself, and we should keep an eye on that, because as America's political solution becomes less possible, that you may see the military take a larger role at some point in this, as the last institution in which the United States citizens, I think, broadly have support, and that in the worst of all outcomes, that may end up playing a decisive role in our future. I know that's not something you're used to thinking about in the United States. It happens all over the world. It's not that uncommon. It's important to remember, before he was emperor, Caesar was the general who won a lot of battles in France. Gaul, as it was called back then. Anyway, throughout his tenure, Mr. Trump has dismissed warnings and findings from his intelligence services, with Democrats alleging he ignored repeated intel community warnings in January and February about the coming COVID virus and potential deadly spread inside the United States. That's a little bit disingenuous from the Independent. In truth, back then, and you can look this up, they were complaining that Trump was closing borders because he was a racist bigot. And this just shows you, and I only mention that not to be provocative, but I'm only saying that because we have reached the point where in the West, in the United States, ideology always trumps a sane response. And the sane response was the right-wing solution to close the borders and not bring in more people, the left-wing solution to provide money to people to keep them safe. And we can't do that because you can't allow the other side to win because they're a bigger threat to you than the virus. And that's what we live with in the United States. So I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do this. I'm going to close with two stories. I wanted just to let you see. I'm going to grab two things because I don't read partisan pieces, okay? I really don't. But I want you to see just how divergent the narratives are. And we're going to read a piece that was written from a left-wing perspective by Sasha Abramsky in The Nation about how they're in a Democratic paper, which is what The Nation is, how they're presenting the Republicans. And I want to go ahead and put this out, and we're going to read a piece from Ricochet, which is a place that covers conservative conversation, and then how they see Democrats. And then you tell me how these people are going to work together. And I'm just going to read the pieces. I'm going to try to restrain myself in commentary other than to ask you a question as we listen to all of these things. Whatever agreements or disagreements you have with the pieces, and actually it's interesting to see them talking over each other rather than to each other, ask how you bring these things back together, because we've looked around the world that countries are starting to get their act together a little bit, and that they're doing so because they can come together on common agreements and common interests, that they can sit and talk together instead of thinking, hey, how is factionalism going to work? And in the American example, I would remind you, in the beginning of our country, General Washington, our first president, told us that if we became factional, we would wreck the whole thing. Here we are, 250 years later, about the tipping point at which a lot of empires die, and we are at a point where this is what's happening. So we're going to start with the Democratic criticism of Republicans, and then we're going to go to the Republican criticism of Democrats. And if these piss you off, that's okay. I'm doing this gently because I want to show you how bad is out there. And let me tell you, I am doing a nice job pulling a lot of things out, because the amount of expletives I could grab if I did this in a not nice way of what people are saying and thinking about one another is only getting worse, and we need something quick to change how this works, because this is spiraling far beyond the virus to something far worse. And I can tell you the story. In fact, I'm probably going to have to go out there and try to figure out a third way to help some people to it. But this is literally where we're at. So this is what you're reading if you're reading left-wing news today for our audience who doesn't get to hear this. And this piece is from The Nation, Sasha Abramsky, today, 5:47 a.m. Trump and GOP to The Nation, go bankrupt and drop dead. They're promoting policies that could not only push the economy, but the U.S. government to the breaking point. In normal times, a report by the UN's International Labor Organization predicting that 1.6 billion people whose incomes support fully half the world's population are on the verge of losing their livelihoods would be the only thing anyone on Earth would be paying attention to. But in the COVID moment, such extraordinary predictions become mere footnotes. Take a deep breath, however, and ponder what is being said here, because for it is, without any doubt, today's signal. Half the world's population is at imminent risk of economic devastation, hunger, endless debt, closed schools, the collapse of entire social systems. In normal times, the U.S. president would be coordinating a global response to mitigate this disaster, coordinating distribution of medical supplies, shoring up global food distribution systems, working with the IMF and other agencies to extend desperately needed credit and aid to countries whose economies risk complete system failure. The alternative is a cascading economic crisis that could send much of the world into the dark ages. One quick interjection. The left always thinks that it's the job of America to go take care of everyone because people are just people, but they don't realize that that is exactly what has caused the right to go insane, because the people who have often been hurt the most are poor people in this country who are neglected because other people are thought to have it worse. I'll just tell you that, see, you can understand, because I want the sides to understand each other, because you don't. I know you don't. I mean, maybe some of my listeners do, but a lot of you don't. And I want you to understand why, that the red and blue are so different in this world, because I've been in both camps. Honestly, I've worked as campaign managers on both parties. I know how you all think. But these aren't normal times. Instead, as the New York Times documented in a remarkably detailed analysis, Donald Trump, who has been absent as global leader, holds propagandist press briefings even less credible than the daily briefings by U.S. generals during the Vietnam War, in which he either congratulates himself, mocks his political opponents, peddles conspiracy theories, or promotes quack cures for COVID, such as injecting bleach. Another interjection. Every time the party opposite goes in there, the media attacks him that way. Believe me, the same thing happened when Obama was in there. Go back. It's universal. You can go back into the 1860s. It's always been that way. The Irish Daily Mirror, gobsmacked by America's downward spiral, recently averred it is incumbent on Congress to bleach this manifestly unfit, unstable president. And those among the parochial MAGA crowd inclined to dismiss the ILO report as abstract and distant from American concerns should think again. Here in America, states and cities are projecting a $500 billion shortfall, and there's serious risk that public safety agencies, schools, and vital services will soon start being slashed to the bone. Mitch McConnell's callous response lets the states, especially blue states with more generous pension systems for public sector employees, go bankrupt. In fact, rather than work around the clock on developing aid packages to keep states from cratering, McConnell, who is well aware Trump's re-election chances are fading by the day, wants to turn the Senate's attention to rushing through even more extremist judicial nominees while he still has the chance. Trump, for his part, wants to blackmail liberal states by withholding financial aid from them unless they scrap sanctuary policies that are providing a modicum of protection to immigrants who are being hunted down by ICE agents. Stop for a second. So the question of identity is at the heart of this, right? And the left's basic identity view of the world is that whoever is the greatest victim deserves the greatest support. The right's basic identity structure is whoever is a part of my family deserves the greatest support. And the fact that we've learned to define these things differently is really interesting. Historically, what the left has done in terms of its internationalism has very rarely been tried and has always ended badly. And I will say that, look at how empires collapse because they try to be all things to all people. And the right has gone along with it in exchange for getting a lot of money. That's been the bribe of international globalism. And let's be very clear. Globalism is what accelerated the spread of this virus. Globalism is what's causing all these issues for food dependency because we don't have local solutions, because someone thought somewhere they could do it cheaper elsewhere, they could make a buck on the process. And this is a criticism these are structural criticisms that are much larger than partisanship. But I want you to see these pieces so that you understand in a little bit more detail where the problems are. And I want to say that this commentary, as harsh as it is of what McConnell and Trump are doing, has a lot of validity because they are playing for partisan gain, where functionally they are trying to impose an ideology that realistically, at this point, is sort of reverting to a form of radical libertarianism that I would say is more honestly typical of what the American founders intended in our history, but is actually completely non-cognizant of what the virus requires. And so you are seeing the subversion of the reality on the ground to what is happening in the ideology. But my goal here is just to go ahead and say it out there, because what happens is they play, and the left does this, they say these are the real victims and these are horrible people because they don't really like to talk in terms of they talk in terms of institutions, and they talk in terms of like feelings and how you want to feel bad for people in different groups. But it's a problem where you have to realize in this choice that every time you give support to A, you give help to A, you're taking away from B. And that's what happens when you're in a constricting economy. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't look for baking a bigger cake. That's a good solution, but you have to do that in a way where you take care of your people first. And that's been the failure of the left. What they have done in America, and let's be honest about this, is that they've said, okay, our people are the people who live in our cities, and in the poor people who we like, and the best of the hicks in the country we don't like. So if you're out there, and I'll tell you, if you want to know who can be made fun of, go on Twitter. You could attack anyone who's white, male, heterosexual, and a rural person. You can make fun of them all day. You won't get banned. You say anything about someone who's diverse, multicultural in the cities, alternate identity, you'll be banned in 5 seconds. And so there is this hypocrisy where some groups are treated one way and some groups are treated another. And it goes both ways. Don't think it's the same. There are people on the right who absolutely would attack people who are of these divergent entities. And I want to show you that you guys are mirror images of each other that are lining up in camps wanting to fight. And unless you find a way to get around that on a new common identity, we end up with a civil war. And that's fine. That's where we may end up. But I want you to see how this is happening. When you create a victim, okay, you also create an oppressor. I've read Frantz Fanon, and I'm very familiar with leftist philosophies, and it's true that there is an other. There's always an other, but the other creates an oppressor, and that's why you need to have new syntheses emerge. And we need a new synthesis in America. We desperately need it. That's not even an argument. The left and right aren't providing it, but the left is making this argument. So this combined with the scandalous decision to withhold stimulus checks from all mixed status families, so that's to say people. Now, that terminology, if I was a right-winger, I would say this decision, along with the decision to go ahead and give money only to Americans, not people who are here breaking the law, you're saying the same exact thing, but you redefine the narrative around a set of facts in a way where you cannot meet in the center, and that's what we've done. It means that millions of Americans, including hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizen children, disproportionately clustered in the country's biggest and most dynamic cities, are being deliberately pushed into destitution by the administration because one member of their family lacks legal status. And that's absolutely true. I said at the beginning you had to make everyone whole, that if you don't do that, then you're going to have whole groups of people leading uprisings. Keep that in mind as this gets worse. This goes far beyond the standard rough and tumble of partisan politics. Letting America's largest states and cities go bankrupt and deliberately pushing immigrant communities into destitution would be akin to national suicide, or at least the country that was coming into being, right? It would beggar large parts of the country just as surely as the collapse of the Soviet Union, followed by the looting of the country's wealth during the subsequent shock therapy privatization period, beggared tens of millions of citizens. Decades later, many parts of the former USSR still have not recovered from the economic devastation of the implosion, and many residents lack even the most basic income security. Trump's lackluster response to the COVID pandemic has been bad enough. Now the GOP is promoting policies in response to the economic fallout, many of them animated by harsh anti-immigrant prejudice, that could push not only the economy but the U.S. system of government with its carefully calibrated balance of power between states and Washington to the breaking point. Already in cities like Las Vegas, where the economy is reliant on tourism, the shutdown has resulted in mass hunger. Stark television images this week showed miles-long line of cars driven by unemployed casino, hotel, and restaurant workers lining up for food given out by food banks and now shuttered casinos. And the noise, the mindless, maskless MAGA machismo of Vice President Mike Pence, who refused to abide by Mayo Clinic guidelines to wear a mask while visiting patients. So, what they're doing is they're showing here, stay strong, stay healthy, and keep on fighting like hell for a better, saner, kinder tomorrow. Okay. We're the good guys. You're the bad guys. You're trying to kill us. You're ruining what we care about. We can't live with you. That's the story. That's what the Democrat says about the Republican. Let's go ahead and read a piece now from Ricochet, okay? And I'm not taking a side. I'm just trying to read these stories so you understand. This piece was written by a person named Rodan and Ricochet. A lot of people on the right use pseudonyms because otherwise you get banned from everywhere, right? Day 99. COVID 1984, the Western States packed prison. And they have a map here of states that are run by Democrats and Republicans. 5 states led by progressive governors and controlled by the Democratic Party have banded together in a Western States Pact to coordinate the criteria under which they'll resume economic activity in their respective states. In other words, we'll decide together when our people will be free. Of course, the language of the pact sounds elevated. As part of the Western States Pact, the governors commit to working together toward the following 4 goals. Protecting vulnerable populations at risk for severe disease if infected. This includes a concerted effort to prevent and fight outbreaks in nursing homes and other long-term care facilities, ensuring an ability to care for those who may become sick with COVID-19 and other conditions. This will require adequate hospital surge capacity and supplies of personal protective equipment. Mitigating the non-direct COVID-19 health impacts, particularly on disadvantaged communities. Protecting the general public by ensuring any successful lifting of interventions includes the development of a system for testing, tracking, and isolating. The states will work together to share best practices. When progressive governors, quote, share best practices, end quote, civil liberties are a secondary consideration, and doubtless central command of the state economy will be one of those best practices. Attorney General Barr issued a memo to U.S. attorneys around the country yesterday detailing the need to monitor state and local governments in their jurisdiction for violations of civil rights. I am directing each of our United States attorneys to be on the lookout for state and local directives that could be violating the constitutional rights and civil liberties of individual citizens, Barr wrote. As the Department of Justice explained recently in guidance to states and localities taking steps to battle the pandemic, even in times of emergency, when reasonable and temporary restrictions are placed on rights, the First Amendment and federal statutory law prohibit discrimination against religious institutions and religious believers. The legal restrictions on state and local authority are not limited to discrimination against religious institutions and religious believers, Barr continued. For example, the Constitution also forbids, in certain circumstances, discrimination against disfavored speech and undue interference with the national economy. If a state or local ordinance crosses the line from an appropriate exercise of authority to stop the spread of COVID into an overbearing infringement of constitutional and statutory protections, the DOJ may have an obligation to address that overreach in federal court. So, the piece continues. The Western States Pact has helpfully identified South California, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and Colorado as places to be on the lookout for state and local directives that could violate the constitutional rights and civil liberties of the individual citizens. Even as other states are reopening their economies, the pact states will be continuing house arrest for its citizens until their safety surveillance system is completely international. Undue interference with the national economy is going to be an interesting issue. With about a fifth of the U.S. population incarcerated in these states, it seems the undue interference with the national economy is sort of a given. Powerline provides a timely reminder of how undue interference works. I don't think our political class in Washington or the state capitals have the slightest idea of how they have disrupted the workings of our economy beyond the mere measure of the huge number of people filing for unemployment, which they think can be simply fixed by printing more money and sending out checks. The good folks at CEI produced the embedded 6-minute video of iPencil a few years back, and it makes for salutary viewing just now as our government contemplates plans for reopening the economy. Give it a look and contemplate the effects the shutdown is having on the millions of daily decisions made by producers and consumers alike. Maybe our political class needs to just get the hell out of the way. And that may happen sooner rather than later in some parts of the country, but the Western States Pact prison is likely to remain closed for a while, even as health data demonstrates that although not defeated, COVID is waning in those jurisdictions, beach parties or not. And what they're basically saying is that the right is saying, well, the left is making a prison where they're telling me what I have to do, and I'm not going to deal with this because this stupid virus is only killing 1% of people, and why should 50% of us have to live in a country where we're told how to do for the rest of our lives, never do what we want, never think again, all because you're scared of this stupid little virus, and that you've all the time been looking to take away our rights. You've been looking to tell us how to live every aspect of our lives. You've been telling us for 20 years everything we think is wrong, everything we want is wrong, everything we are is wrong, and we're not going to take it anymore. You want to fight, you got it. That's what the right thinks. And I'm saying it because I've given that speech many times. I'm very well familiar with that speech. And maybe if I was literally looking at this from the perspective of thinking the virus was fake, which a lot of people can now because this is how it's being reported, the president made it this way, okay? Deliberately or not deliberately. And this is where we're at. And this is why the fight's happening. So the left is saying that they're trying to bankrupt everything we're doing to help people. And the left thinks that, to be fair, and most people in cities agree with that. This is how they exist. They exist in a highly interdependent structure. The rural areas and the red states exist in a highly independent structure, and now we've reached a crisis between individual identity and collective identity, where in the lack of common interest, we are now fighting each other, and in the meantime, viruses are going to kill people. Many people have died in New York. Many people are going to die in Georgia. Red state, blue state. Doesn't matter. Red state, blue state, virus state, dead state. We need a different solution, and the problem is no one has the credibility to be on the other side. And look, I've tried. I mean, the reason, in my own life, man, I started out doing a project that was locally oriented, and basically one side decided to attack me because the far left constrains the sane left by attacking anyone who disagrees with them. And the far right, no, it's not the far right. The far left constrains the center left by basically saying to them, you can't talk to these people, they're bad because they're intolerant. And the bought right constrains the sane right by saying that, well, you have to allow absolute liberty on the one hand, or they'll put moral issues around it that go the other way. And what you find is a very small amount of people make it impossible for the very large amount of people who just want to sanely survive, have a conversation. So I'll submit to you that we need to find a radical center that we can agree upon of the things we can agree upon that we're going to do together, the places we can disagree and accept that we can live with those disagreements by keeping them private like we did for a long time, and how we can, within that construct, work for the virus. And I will tell you, it's not coming from D.C. It's going to get worse there. And states working in groups might be the solution, or it might have to get more local than that, because I'm not convinced that's going to hold either when you look at how the partisanship just racks around that. And what I invite each of you to think about as we go forward is where the new center is, where we can go ahead and find a solution to this that saves all of the people who are here. And I will say, and look, I'm fine with offending people. We have to deal with the people who are here, including the many people who are here illegally, who I personally believe never should have been brought here. But, Republicans who are going to complain about that should look at the people who funded a lot of their people in there, who kept the businesses, and the fact that you had a Republican Congress and a Republican House that didn't do anything about immigration for 2 years because the Chamber of Commerce cared more than the voters. And that's your Republican leadership, okay? And don't think the Democrats don't like having these problems here. The reason the Democrats love having all these people come in here, and they changed. In my family, I grew up in a Democratic family. A lot of people don't know this. That in the 80s and 90s, hardcore, right-winger like New York Democrat Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to talk about how bringing people in from other countries would cost jobs for American citizens, including poor, primarily African-American people who were displaced by Latino labor that came in before they had the coalitions of color develop, as an idea that these are all people who can be put in a certain direction using identity politics, and where you would bring in 1 million people per year, 70% of whom were going to vote every year for Democrats. There was a lot of cynicism on all sides, and at this point, who's here is who's here. It's all water under the bridge. The question is different. What do we end up doing? What can we talk about working together? And if we can't work together in our government, then we need a new government. We need new people, and if that means we need people are going to argue for revolutions based upon pre-existing ideas, and my difference is what I think is we need an evolution that deals with the problems in front of us, where we use whatever we can create to try to solve this virus, and understand that in that process the bad actors reveal themselves and they move aside. And that's what I'm going to talk about, because I'm going to have to talk about a civil war coming into brewing, and whether that war goes hot or not, I can't tell you. I don't know. I hope it doesn't. If it does, then the virus runs roughshod, and it's going to be ugly. It's going to be real ugly. And if it happens, I'll tell you that too. I mean, heck, who knows? Maybe I'll grow the beard a little longer and don a cap and get out there. But I hope for a third way, and that's what we're all about. So let's, as we go through today and we go into the weekend, I decided to include these last two stories because I wanted to let you see how toxic it got. And I want to give you context as you look at those people out there. People are motivated by fear. They're scared. They don't know what the future has. They don't trust what's out there. They don't trust each other. They don't trust the other side. They've lost their job. They've lost their money. And they're looking for comfort in the familiar, including a lot of the leaders who needed to show vision, and instead they're showing recalcitrance. And we need a vision of the future. We need something that's good. So let's pray for that something like that will emerge, and try to have a little bit of humanity and understanding people not like you as you go through this. And I'll try to do it too. I always talk to everyone. You guys know that. I accept my reproaches, my reproofs, And it's hard for me. It's hard. I'm not used to talking about certain things certain ways, and it would be easier for me to go out there. Frankly, I could go out this weekend and lead the group over here in Maine that's going to do something that I think isn't very smart. But it would not be useful, and it's not the answer, and we need the answer. So, Heavenly Father, I pray that you give us the ability to talk to one another. When Jesus traveled, he spoke to people from all walks of life. He had around him people who were tax collectors and fishermen, carpenters and prostitutes, people from the high of society and people of the low of society, and found a radical new truth of acceptance and support of a greater good that was able to bring people forward, not because it compelled people to act, but because it drew on our conscience and our higher instincts, in the understanding that when we work together and when we find what we can enjoy, when we seek that higher truth that you have promised us, and that chance to exist within the goodness and greatness of divinity, of God himself, of the Father that I personally worship, and I think all of us live underneath, that we can begin to find a way to solution, and we look for a third solution. We pray to the heavens to help lead us away from these traps, because in reality, we are chasing two different traps. One where we think humanity is a religion unto itself, the other where we think money is the greater of all goods, and where we need to go ahead and find things that bring us together, that transcend both our humanity and our economic needs, that beyond health and beyond economy, we need a truth that we can cling to together, and from which we can build a new core to go ahead and save ourselves from the horrible onslaught of both economic degradation, degradation, loss of food, loss of safety, and for the health issues that are out there, and that this truth and this safety can be for all people who come together in common concert. And I pray that you lead us toward that direction, and that you allow my voice to serve as a positive force in bringing people both to safety and to the greater understanding of the life that is beyond the one we experience in this world, and that should hopefully guide us so that we can become better than the war of all against all that I fear will befall this once great country. In Jesus' name I pray that. Amen. It's a deep, heavy prayer. It's a hard time, and use the weekend to rest up, recover. I'll go on tonight at Friday with your questions. People have asked me. I'm going to go ahead and talk about Florida's problems in some depth. I also agreed to do humor. If those of you who missed it, I did a pretty funny impression, I'm told, of a rabid right-winger. I will do a left-winger today, equal fairness. And, it's kind of funny, we live in a post-genre world where news crosses with comedy. I do that some of my spare times. I'm just a person trying to survive like each and every one of you. Thank you for spending time with me every morning. I appreciate that. We'll continue putting this story forward. I do the best I can. I get a lot wrong. I own my failures, but I am trying to help people be aware. And for each and every one of the people in this group here, you always ask, we spend a lot of time at the beginning talking about preparedness. I haven't talked about that enough recently. I think we're going to talk about that a lot more. But remember, never get into commitments you can't get out of. Be prepared for anything to happen. Be hyper aware of what's happening in your area. And if you're going to trust people on a personal basis. Don't let how you see people be fully mediated by things you disagree upon, because if you do, it won't be long before you hate everybody, you can't work with anybody. And the bigger idea that we need to have is the idea that life has some value for everyone beyond whatever our immediate disagreements are. With that message, I'll leave you to enjoy your weekend. God bless. This has been Coronavirus Central, episode 60. Tom Kaczynski signing out.